panelists have to say, and of course to the discussion and questions that follow that. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Anderson. Appreciate your comments. Next up is our Senator George Barker. Mr. Barker, Senator, thank you for joining us.
Excuse me, I think I thank you for inviting me here tonight. I'm not quite sure. Normally about this time of year, Delegate Anderson and I and others get invited to come talk about what went on down at the legislative session. So usually I get to come talk about something I actually know a good bit about. But this year it's sort of a new topic here, something that we haven't been dealing with in Richmond. So Delegate Anderson and I have both been learning about it this week. What's the sequestration stuff? Because I guarantee you that when we're in Richmond during the legislative session, if it doesn't happen within about a mile of where the state capitol is, it doesn't exist. We have no clue what's going on outside of downtown Richmond. So we're catching up, playing catch up here. And as I said, normally we get to come talk about things going on at the legislative session. Often, what that means is that we get to come up here and talk about all the things we tried to do. Things that we, in the end, most of the time didn't get done. And so you have us up here to actually, embarrass us and say, we didn't get this done, we didn't get that done. This year, we actually got a lot of things done, so what do? You don't ask us to talk about it. You ask us to talk about something we don't know anything about. So. But I'm going to find a way to work it in anyway. Because when the sequestration was coming into effect, it was right after the end of the legislative session. And there were a few comments from both Republican and Democratic representatives to Congress saying, geez, we ought to learn how to do things like they do down in Richmond. Because this year we did get a number of things done. And we did it without having that blunt instrument sort of hanging over us, without something that was forcing us to try to do things we really didn't want to do. On the other hand, what's happened in Congress is that there was this blunt instrument basically designed solely to force them to do something they didn't want to do, and they still didn't do it. So at least it's a pleasure to be back from Richmond with something having gotten accomplished, and I'll fill you in a little bit now on what I've learned this week on the non-defense aspects of sequestration. As Delegate Anderson said, sequestration is set up to, in effect, cut about $1 trillion out of the deficit over the next 9 years. Most people sort of think of sequestration as something that's happened in this fiscal year. It's actually planned to go all the way through 2021. So from 2013 to 2021, there are a series of substantial cuts that are proposed. And the cuts, the $85 billion that Delegate Anderson talked about that's on the books for this fiscal year, is less than what's coming in future years. So if you think this year's bad, just wait till you get 2 or 3 years down the road on things, and it's going to keep escalating there. Now, as Delegate Anderson said, the cuts that are proposed, and this goes all the way through, are 50-50. Half of it is defense cuts, half of it is non-defense cuts. So it ends up being, in this particular fiscal year, ends up being about $42 to $43 billion on each side to get to the $85 billion total. On the non-defense side, what that means is there are actually sort of 4 categories of spending that are affected in different ways. There's the non-defense discretionary spending and the non-defense mandatory spending, both of which are proposed to are being cut a little over 5% this fiscal year, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Then there's Medicare, which is being cut 2%, and then there are a number of programs that are not being cut at all. There are various programs that are exempted from it, and I'll talk a little bit about those in a minute. Now, the 5% cut just on the surface might not sound like a whole lot until you factor in that there's already been a lot of cuts in recent years on both the defense and non-defense side, so it's just sort of piling on in terms of the impacts there. The other thing is to remember is that we're already well into the fiscal year, which started October 1st. So what is a 5% cut for the year as a whole means that starting now and going through the rest of the year, it's about a 10% cut in terms of the non-defense spending. So it is a huge cut that is looming ahead of us here, and it clearly will be felt over the next several months, and it's clear that it's going to be implemented this particular year. On the Medicare side, it's said they limited it to a 2% cut, so there will be cuts, and that will mean probably some cuts in payment levels to various provider groups. And let me assure you that the various provider groups have been resisting this for many years because many of them are now being paid substantially less than what the private insurance plans are paying, or in some instances are being paid less than what it actually costs them to provide the care. So you start adding cuts to that in addition. There are certainly some significant impacts. There are already a number of physicians and others who are not taking Medicare patients, and particularly not taking new patients who are Medicare patients. And that's before these cuts start, which are 2% this year, and they're slated to continue for 8 more years to come. The types of things, however, that are exempt from it, just to give you some examples, Social Security payments are exempt, so there's no cut coming in Social Security payments. The Veterans Department is exempt from cuts. However, a lot of the services that veterans receive are not through the Veterans Department. So there are a number of employment programs that are affecting veterans that are not in the Veterans Administration. They are being cut. There are a number of housing programs. They are being cut. There are a number of programs that provide services for PTSD and various mental health issues that a number of the returning vets have. A lot of those are being cut. So there are huge effects even on the veterans that are being felt there. There are various children's programs that are not being cut, things like foster care services and adoption support and things like that. And also the Medicaid program is not being cut. It's clearly essential that the Medicaid program not be cut because Medicaid, if Medicaid were to be cut, it doesn't eliminate the cost, it just shifts more of it to the state level. So we would just be picking up that expense if that were being cut. So there are major cuts that are coming on down the line. What I'll do now is just sort of go through highlight a couple of the types of cuts that are being faced in the non-defense side and talk a little bit about some of what it means for the greater Prince William area, including the county and the 2 cities here. There are substantial cuts in education funding. And education, the federal government is not the largest provider of education funding. We get more money from the state government, more money from local government, but it's not an insignificant player in it. Just in terms of general support for education, Prince William County is going to lose about $1 million this year. In addition, programs for services for children with disabilities, another $1 million is going to affect the county. The Head Start program, we're probably going to lose slots for about 80 children in the Head Start program. And that's, so there are a lot of cuts that are affecting the various education services that are provided here in the county. And basically a couple of things has to happen. Either the county is going to have to pick up more of it, or we're going to lose services, it's going to increase class sizes, do a lot of the types of things that the school system's already been struggling with and actually doing very well in terms of student performance, but certainly has had to absorb a lot of cuts in terms of money per student in recent years. There are cuts in funding for law enforcement and a lot of prevention and training types of things that are provided. A lot of job support programs are being affected. Child care services, vaccines for children. 100 Prince William County residents will no longer be able to receive treatment for substance abuse services. 50 individuals will no longer be able to get tests for HIV, those types of things. 50 abused women who are getting services now will lose those services. $80,000 in funding for Meals on Wheels. So there are a lot of things that we don't necessarily think of as being federally funded, but clearly do affect us here at the local level. And when you stop and think about it, just think that this is not only happening this year, but this is scheduled to occur again every year for the next 8 years just to keep compounding. So you can imagine what the net effect on that would be. There are some cuts to small business, and Nancy may talk a little bit about that are tied in there. Just to take it to a national level now and talk about some of the things that are there. The FBI and other law enforcement, we're going to lose about 1,000 positions there. Customs and Border Patrol, almost 10,000 positions being lost in Customs and Border Patrol. And there have been concerns in recent years that we need to beat that up, not take a hit there. Certainly there's been a lot of attention in the news lately to issues related to aviation safety. There are a lot of towers that are being closed. Traffic control towers, fortunately here, the one in Manassas was on that gray area, but is being kept open for right now. But there are a lot of places that are losing their towers and the staff that go with that. Scientific research, NIH funding is being cut significantly, and there's already some scrambling going on as to how we're going to be able to continue some of the research projects for there and deferring starting a lot of other additional research projects. Drug approvals will probably take longer than what they do now for FDA and others to be able to handle things. As I said, the veteran service is exempt, but there are a lot of services for veterans that clearly are affected. Been a couple of articles in the paper recently about the impacts upon national parks and things like that. Because each national park suddenly has to, reduce its budget. So for some of the parks that are open just in the summer, that means they have a shorter season. There are less services, those types of things. So there are, a whole host of things. There are a number of things that do affect people of very modest income. For example, the WIC program, the Food and Nutrition Program for women, infants, and children is facing a significant cut. So, there are a huge number of services that are clearly being affected. And all that is happening, and it's going to be exacerbated here because it's in this fiscal year, even though it's a little over 5% cut overall in most of these programs, it's about a 10% cut in the remaining half of the year that's available, and that's only year one of an 8-year program. So with that, I'll stop, and we'll go on from here, and then I'll be happy to answer questions about this or about all the wonderful things that Rich and I did. We could spend 20 minutes talking on texting while driving, so whatever you want to talk about, we'll be happy to fill you in. We got that bill passed this year.
Thank you, Senator. And I know I have questions. I know the audience has questions. And we certainly appreciate what both of you do in Richmond. I know that Richmond-centric is in my shop. It's Prince William-centric. Everything, if it doesn't happen in Prince William, I don't care about it. I'm not going to write about it. But we do want to bring up Nancy, who I know does spend time in Washington and can give us a perspective on small business and what this might mean for us.
Thanks, Uriah. Good evening. So as Uriah said, I was asked to kind of give more of an economic, window into what we're facing. Rich and George did a great job of kind of laying out the cuts that are coming and the impacts that they'll have. But I wanted to go into what this means for our local economy as well as our regional economy and certainly our state economy. So last fall, the Virginia Economic Development Partnership, which is essentially the economic development agency for the state, coordinated with George Mason University on a study to show what sequestration would mean for Virginia. And out of that study, they found some interesting numbers, at least interesting for us here locally on the local business level. That statewide, Virginia is home to approximately 25,000 federal contractors. And more than 5,000 of those are direct defense contractors. So that's statewide. Most of those, however, are in Hampton Roads or here in Northern Virginia. And the makeup of that tends to be in Hampton Roads, where it's more hard, actual building of products, ships, and things of the like. In Northern Virginia, we tend to be a little more intellectual capital, IT, cybersecurity. So that's good news for Northern Virginia because, is what you didn't hear Rich mentioned a lot of cuts in those two areas. And so that's going to save Northern Virginia a little bit, but not completely. Though because these are contractors, the federal government has very been dependent, especially in the defense industry, on using contract work for labor and for intellectual research. Those contractors are all that more vulnerable to federal cuts and reduced spending. It was interesting to note, too, in the study that Virginia, not only for manpower, but Virginia is also home to more than 500 federal leased facilities, as well as we know, several dozen military installations. And what that means is that the federal government is actually leasing office space from the private sector around the state. So as they cut back on their footprints around the country, in Virginia, we are likely to feel that even more so than any other part of the country because of the large footprint that they have here. So I want to take those numbers kind of down to what that means in Northern Virginia. In Northern Virginia, we have a roughly direct federal government employment of about 58,000 residents. Of that, though, approximately a little over 110,000 are somehow related to the federal government. So they're in a contractor or a subsidiary type of agency. As Delegate Anderson mentioned in his remarks, sequestration, we're likely to lose anywhere from 130 to 200,000 jobs here in Virginia. But when you think about the amount that are actually here in Northern Virginia, here in Prince William locally and regional-wide, we could see up to 60% of those cuts occur here. That means job losses here in our region. What does that mean to our local economy? It's kind of startling when you look at the breakdown of our regional economy as a whole. And in this case, when I say region, I'm referring to the greater Washington metropolitan area, which includes Maryland, Washington, D.C., and all of Northern Virginia. But currently, approximately 40% of our regional GDP is based on federal spending. When you break that down kind of at a national level, that same region is only 4.7% of the entire U.S. population. But we are recipients of approximately 9% of all federal spending and 15% of all DoD spending. Of that spending, 21% of all that federal spending is subject to sequestration. So when you look at 40% of our GDP subject to 21% cuts, that's a major impact to our region. It's not all doom and gloom because the private sector business community is very adept and very nimble at changing and learning how to learn from and be resilient in a troubling economy, as we have been doing over the last 5 years or so. So I think you'll see over the next 5 years that percentage of the federal government as a percentage of our GDP shrink down to closer to 30% as the private business sector transitions from less of a business to government model of business to more of a business to business services. But I want to talk about what the multiplier effect of this reduced federal spending will be. You know, certainly you're seeing it in contracts being canceled, federal contracts being canceled at large contractors that are then canceling contracts with subcontractors. Those subcontractors are then having to cancel contracts with suppliers for goods or services. And then you're seeing decreased household spending as those private sector contractors are having to lay off their workforce, reduce their hours, whatnot. So you're starting to see a ripple effect through our regional economy of the suppliers and subcontractors and supporting industries as they start to contract. Rich mentioned that 10% of the Prince William residents are employed by the federal government, but little people know that we are home to almost 300 federal contractors here in Prince William County. About 170 of those are defense related, and they employ roughly 6,000 people in this county. Not all those people are residents of Prince William. Many are residents of other jurisdictions in the area and certainly jurisdictions to our south. But that's a large number of people that could be directly impacted by these potential cuts. And when you are looking in the face of the furloughs that are coming, and I can't remember which one of the previous speakers mentioned, the potential of 20% of our disposable income region-wide essentially going away overnight. It's absolutely true. When you look at the proposed cuts that are coming from the Defense Department alone, you're hearing anywhere from 1 to 2 days a week, mandatory furloughs. That's essentially one paycheck, 1 month's paycheck for a federal employee. So you think about how that trickles down to their spending. They're going out to restaurants, they're doing discretionary things, going shopping. Those are all going to contract. And in speaking with our chamber members, the Prince William Chamber has a very robust government contracting committee of about a little over 300 members. Some of them are located outside of Prince William County in the city of Manassas or Manassas Park, but also in other jurisdictions up to Dulles Airport and Tyson's Corner. And some of them are not contractors, banks and whatnot, people who do business with contractors. But we're hearing more and more from them concern about what the impact is directly on them. But what we're also been hearing for about the last year is that they've actually been feeling the effects of the sequestration for quite a while. Many of our chamber members have reported that their businesses have not been paid for their federal contracts in months or years. Contracts have been canceled, and certainly before the end of last year, we heard a rash of contracts being canceled by DoD. That's not unusual. People would go through the work and put a bid on the contract. The bid was given, and then the contract was canceled. Or options on continuing contracts were either changed or canceled at the last minute. Those have immediate impacts on the ability of those businesses to hire and retain employees. So you're seeing contractors locally that have had to shut their doors, or their principals have been going without pay so that they can maintain pay for their paid employees, or they've been instituting their own furloughs or even layoffs. Many, though, are being successful at transitioning their business model from a business to government contracting source to a business to business. And I said earlier, it's not all doom and gloom because the private sector is very agile at change. We've been dealing with a struggling economy for about 5 years now. And sequestration is really just a continuation of the uncertainty in the economy that has existed over the last several years. And it's just typical known economic policy is that, in uncertain times, businesses tend to hunker down, they don't hire, they don't invest, and you start to see stagnation. So I think while the immediate impact of sequestration will be very painful here, but the longer term will be a very stagnant economy. I don't think we will see huge amounts of houses sitting empty or people without work because there will be a shifting of resources, but we will see an economy that's not able to grow. This is on top of other concerns that the business community is facing locally, nationally, statewide, in the uncertainty that exists over changes in federal healthcare law, uncertainty over federal tax structure. So there's lots of things that businesses are facing right now that create lots of uncertainty. So for our local businesses here in Prince William, the effect of the federal cuts, particularly in the defense side, on top of everything else, just compounds the factor. And so that's what we're facing, getting the time clock.
Thank you very much. If you haven't got dessert in the back, I don't know if there's any left, but it is sweet. It might cheer you up. Might bring you up a little bit. Got frosting on top, so that's one that we can offer you up here. And finally, we'd like to bring up the Honorable Maurice McTeague, who has had the pleasure of and really the advantage of taking notes and listening to everyone and finding out what jokes work and what jokes don't, like mine. So at this point, sir, we'd like to welcome you to the podium.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you to the group for inviting me to come. You're most likely to remember me as the only person in the room who doesn't have an accent. If that's the worst that comes out of it as far as I'm concerned, then that's going to be very good. I'm going to actually try and tell you a bit of a story about what's the reality and what's the facade, what's the truth, and what's the propaganda, because there's a lot of both going on. So this is actually the cause of the problem. And this is a graph that looks at all of the presidencies since President Truman. And it's done on a per capita basis, and it's done in constant dollars. So it's fair to compare it from 1945 through to today. What it actually tells you is that the government today, in per capita terms, spends 400% more than it did at the time of Harry Truman. And that's driving the problems that we're now having to deal with. If you keep on doing that, then Cyprus might look like a good place to live. So, if we look at the next one, this is about sequestration. And so the first thing that I find that people ask is, what does it mean? Well, actually, it's a pretty old term, and it goes back to Britain. And in the 1800s, it was a process that was used in the debtors' courts to secure assets so that they couldn't be degraded until a debt was able to be settled. So that's what it meant. And it actually means to separate out or to hold apart. But it's also gathered another meaning, and that is that it's a reduction in spending. You might think that it's unusual in American terms. It's not. Each year, Congress tends to rephrase that. Congress does, through its budget committee, set spending caps. And then the appropriators go to work and work out how much they're going to spend on each appropriation bill. And it nearly always exceeds the budget caps. But they don't want to have to make the decision about what they should cut. So they just send it all off to the president and he signs it. And then what happens is that Treasury makes the decisions about the things that won't actually get funded. and that's called sequestration. Now, I think that's actually terrible. I think we elected people to make those decisions for us, not a bunch of bureaucrats to make those decisions for us, but that's how it actually happens. So each year, the spending authorities that come through the appropriations are normally not spent because they're in excess of the budget caps. The sequestration, sorry, can we just go back to the sequestration? The sequestration that we're dealing with at the moment was designed as something that should never ever happen. And it was an initiative from the White House at the time of the big debate over the debt ceiling in 2011. And it was intended that it would be so draconian that neither Republicans nor Democrats would want it to occur. So they would find a way of being able to deal with it, and it wouldn't occur. Well, surprise, it did. I saw a poll about 14 days ago, and it said that 67% of Americans believe that Congress can take any issue and make it worse. And the question is, what's wrong with the other 33%? So, sequestration is not a good idea. In fact, it's a terrible idea. Because what it's saying is that every spending item in the government's budget has equal priority or equal value. And that's wrong. If a requirement to cut that level of spending was at the discretion of the department heads, then I think we would see very, very different results than the ones we're seeing at the moment. However, let's look at some of the other things that sequestration was meant to do. Can we have the next one? It was meant to do something about dealing with debt. Well, these two lines represent the dark blue line, what would happen to America's debt without sequestration. And the pale blue line shows you what happens with sequestration. And I've got to say, in my book, neither of them is a success. So we're not making much progress with this particular initiative. We look at the next one. We actually see what happens to federal budget expenditures between 2013 and 2023. One line, the blue line, is without sequestration. The red line is with sequestration. Why are they so close together? Because this process didn't actually address the government's big spenders, which are the entitlement programs. So now you've got this process that's carrying all of the weight and not dealing with the things that really need to be dealt with, the entitlement programs. And until we do that, then I think that we're going to continue to have a major budget crisis. Now, the next slide that I have actually looks at the Department of Defense. And I know it looks weird, but it is actually rather informative because the black bit says that's the base defense budget. The purple bit on the other side is what happens with sequestration. And the pale blue bit is the cost of wars. And Congress has decided, I think appropriately, to keep the cost of fighting wars separate from the base budget of the Defense Department. I actually hope that very soon America gets out of a perpetual status of being at war. And I hope that all of you do too, and I hope that Congress thinks the same as well. So hopefully the pale blue bit can go sometime in the near future. But when you actually look at that, you find that there is a dip in spending inside defence, but for a relatively short period of time. You see, the thing about sequestration is that it doesn't actually reduce spending. What it does is that it reduces the rate of increase in spending. That's not how I measure my spending. If I measure whether I've got to cut my spending, I count it in real dollars, and if I'm spending less real dollars, then I'm cutting spending. But if I'm spending more dollars, then there's no way that I'm cutting spending. That's how most of us do arithmetic. But at a federal level, that hasn't happened. I used to be a Minister of Finance in my country at one time, and one of the things that we did was that we decided that each year in the budget process, like the private sector, we would expect a productivity gain from every delivery organisation, every department. And if you go back to 1980 and you look at productivity increases in the private sector in the United States to today, they have averaged 3.4% per annum. For some weird, inexplicable reason, in 1994, Congress decided that it was going to stop measuring productivity in the public sector at all. I don't think that's a fair deal. You could apply 2% reduction to the base operating budgets of each of those departments and you wouldn't actually need to do sequestration. They'd start off at 98% of last year's operating budget instead of starting off at about 105%. That would make sense. That doesn't mean a reduction of service when you take a productivity gain. It means delivering the same level of services more effectively and more efficiently, so it's not actually a cut. It's getting a better deal. So, is there room for spending reductions inside the US budget? Well, if we look at this last graph, this is how these budgets, and I haven't gone through every spending item of the US government, but this is how these budgets have increased between 2007 and 2013. If I could swap, I'd be happy to go back to 2007 today. And I think most Americans would. Much stronger growth, better capital development and everything like that, and we weren't too unhappy with government. But we can see in every one of these, we're looking at 40, 36, 42, 60%. The only one that's very modest is interest rates, and we know why. The Fed's keeping them low. They're actually monetizing their way out of their debt. So that says to me that if you've only had that money for a year or two, it shouldn't be too difficult to be able to make reasonable decisions about where you would cut. The problem with sequestration is that it isn't based upon reasonable decisions. For example, on Saturday night in the Senate, when they finally made a decision on a budget, we had some very weird things happen. One senator put up a proposal that you could actually take the new quantity of money going to be spent on new uniforms for TSA and give it to the White House, and you would be able to reinstate White House tours. Harry Reid turned that down flat. There was another proposal that said, look at FAA, because it represents 20% of the transportation budget. And what it's being charged with or given is 60% of the cost reductions. So if it was only getting its fair share, you wouldn't be closing all of those towers on regional airports. There is some manipulation going on for political purposes, and that shouldn't actually surprise you. So I think that you should be very skeptical in what you're being told about the things that we're seeing. Finally, today I saw some other polling, my last comment, and this was polling of people's attitudes toward the sequester across the country. 12% of people said that it would have a major effect on them, or was already having a major effect on them. 51% said that they saw no effect at all, and 30% said that they had a minor effect. Asking people to project that forward some months and saying, what do you think will happen then? 59% of people said it would have a positive effect or none. So what's happening here is not necessarily the same as what's happening around the rest of the country. So bear that in mind. Your circumstances are not the same. Can I finish on a positive note by saying this? That year after year after year, as we look at states across the states, the best state or the second best state in the country to do business in is Virginia. That gives you a head start on being able to compete with everybody else. Richmond does a good job at providing you with that edge. See that they continue to do a good job, and I'm sure you're going to weather this crisis in admirable form. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Petit. I wanted to, at this point, we normally take questions from the audience, but I'm going to go ahead and use my moderator's authority, if you will, and ask a few questions on my own because, some interesting points that you all have made here, and so I'll throw this out. It's actually a two-part question, both two sides of the coin. Thinking about another BRAC, that's daunting, and so we hear We know so much of our economy is tied to Quantico and Belvoir, those two military installations. But they are surrounded ever more so by suburban growth. And if you live in that area, you know your windows rattle a lot. And so there have been calls to move Quantico out to a more rural area. But we know that in and around Quantico, we've seen a lot of growth in terms of contractors coming in and offices. So if that becomes an issue, what type of rallying cry would you expect from this community to either keep the base, to make a case for it to stay here, or to send it on its way? What do you think?
Well, that's a good question. And I think that the answer, though, is fairly straightforward, Uriah. And it's simply that Marine Corps Base Quantico is essentially hallowed ground to America's Marine Corps. There's no two ways about it. Every commissioning program is conducted there. Their professional military education at one time was headquarters for the Marine Corps. And every rallying call for the United States Marine is Quantico. So there is absolutely, I would predict, zero opportunity for Quantico to move. It'd be like trying to move Arlington National Cemetery. To the Marines, it is simply hallowed ground. And so I don't see any sort of opportunity for them to move.
If I might just add a little bit, obviously you covered the Quantico situation. Fort Belvoir has got a significant enlargement in this past go around. I don't think they're going to reverse that, so I think that we're pretty safe there. And there are certainly tremendous advantages the military sees to having both of those bases so close to the Pentagon and everything. So I think we're in pretty safe position as it relates to those two. From a Virginia standpoint, however, I think what's really at risk is Hampton Roads. And there's been a lot of talk about moving to Florida, major operations out of Hampton Roads. Hampton Roads is the second largest area of Virginia in terms of population. It's a little bit smaller than Northern Virginia, but not a whole lot. It's substantially larger than the Richmond area. However, Hampton Roads is, Professor talked a little bit about some of the figures in terms of dependence upon the federal government for Northern Virginia. It's much greater in Hampton Roads in terms of the dependence, directly and indirectly, the effect that the military has there. Hampton Roads is also an area that has not been growing significantly. So it's not as if we've been adding a lot of business, a lot of other types of things to diversify our economy. That has not been happening at Hampton Roads. You have a major base move out of Hampton Roads and take a lot with it, and the secondary effects of it would be huge down there, and it would be devastating to all of Virginia in terms of our operations and our budget. That's really where our biggest risk is right now.
I think maybe just to add 2 points. One, Belvoir and Quantico, kind of bordering Prince William, are both integral to our local economy, both as employment centers, but also the kind of secondary businesses that feed off of those. And so I think that discussions that you hear of Quantico going places or things like that, what you're really hearing are the live fire testing is going to move out of Quantico and move farther south, which and moving farther south means to Fort A.P. Hill or to other areas not as populous in Virginia. But I think both Delegate Anderson and Senator Barker are spot on in that there's no way that Belvoir or Quantico are going to leave the area. Secondly, to Senator Barker's point about Hampton Roads being it's more at risk than Northern Virginia, we are a much more diverse economy, and that kind of goes back to my earlier points about how, while it will be hard for us, we will survive because our businesses here are. We are more than just servicing the federal government in Northern Virginia. 20 years ago, that wasn't the case, but today we have a robust IT sector that is totally business to business and business to consumer, product oriented. We have a vibrant tourism industry, vibrant retail industry on all aspects of retail that are not dependent on the federal government. So while it will be hard here, certainly our neighbors to the south are going to be much harder hit.
Thanks, Nancy. Just a very brief comment. given the constraints on military spending, there is not a hope in hell that they're going to get the capital to be able to shift a base anywhere in the next 5 or 6 years. So I think that's a non-starter just for that reason alone.
Well, that brings me to the flip side of the coin of my question. Before coming here, I just left an event with Governor McDonald, who announced that a business is using a state grant, state and local match grant, to expand and hire 350 new employees. And so there's a lot of talk to diversify our economy, not be so tied to defense contracting and to, if you will, the bases. So what types of, first of all, how are our elected officials in Richmond recognizing that we need to diversify our economy, and what options are available to business owners, large and small, in terms of state help?
Well, to kick off the discussion in response to that question, of course, we have a Governor's Opportunity Fund, which is a pretty vigorous incentive pool to bring businesses from out of state into here. I think it is crucial that we diversify our economy to move into other sectors, simply because that fortifies the economy in a way where not one single segment of the economy is vulnerable to these ups and these downs in the economy. So I think that is crucial.
The situation is we're already diversifying. We're already growing rapidly in the private sector. That's where the growth is here. In the last, for years, a century ago, less than 4% of the Virginia population was in Northern Virginia. We're now 28.5%. And we've had a steady growth over the last more than 80 years now. It's just been phenomenal what's happened here in Northern Virginia. There's tremendous diversification. There's tremendous diversification of the population. Our racial ethnic makeup, everything's happening. What's also happened, however, is we have become by far the richest area in the country. In terms of median household income, of the top 5 jurisdictions in the entire country, 4 out of the 5 are in Northern Virginia. And the other one is Los Alamos, New Mexico, where there's not many people, but the ones who are there are a few scientists. In terms of the top 10 nationally, 6 of the top 10 cities and counties are in Northern Virginia. More in Northern Virginia than in the entire rest of the country combined. So in reality, what's happening now is the Governor's Opportunity Funds and those types of things, they don't come to Northern Virginia with very rare exceptions. They go elsewhere to try to help foster economic development in the areas where there is high unemployment because they don't need to come here. Jerry Gordon, who's been head of the Fairfax County Economic Development Authority for years, and who's father of Brian Gordon here in Prince William and father-in-law of Tracy Gordon, who many people here know, he says he's got the best job in the world because when he goes to these economic development conferences around the country, everybody say, what are the incentives that you're providing for businesses to come to Northern Virginia? How much money you're giving? He said, I never give them a dime. They want to come here. We don't have to pay them, to come to this area because they do. In the last several years, every single Fortune 500 company that has moved from one state to another has come to Northern Virginia, basically to Fairfax County. We already have that type of thing, growing population and a growing economy here. In the last, we used to be 30-40% or so of the state growth. Between 2000 and 2010, 45% of more than 45% of the state growth was in Northern Virginia. The Census Bureau figures that came out just a week or two ago said between 2010 and 2012, 62% of the state population growth was in Northern Virginia. We are continuing to grow. We're getting a diversity of economy here that's going to continue to grow, and we're taking advantage of it. Fortunately, we've been doing the right things to help keep it going.
Key thing I'm going to clamp down on you there is they've come to Fairfax County and Nancy in Prince William County. How are we capitalizing on this?
Sure. Thank you. We'd all love to be able to say what Jerry Gordon says, but we're fortunate to, as was mentioned earlier by Maurice, was that we have a very business-friendly state legislature. And they have enabled our local governments, both cities and counties, with many tools in their war chest to be able to attract businesses. That anywhere from being able to provide grants or to provide reductions in tax levels, aid in water services or sewer. There's all kinds of tools that our local governments have to be able to help businesses get through the hump of starting a business and growing your business, but also to grow your business. There are several grant opportunities at the states that the local governments are able to match. Also, a lot of businesses in Prince William are able to be to take part in many grant programs that are provided by the Small Business Administration, which, while a federal agency and certainly subject to some level of cuts with sequestration, are as not being cut as much as other levels. And so programs to provide funding and grants for businesses to locate in kind of hardship areas, which Prince William has quite a bit of along the Route 1 corridor, still exists and are good, robust ways to help businesses move forward and provide incentive. Part, I think, of our economic development effort in Prince William County is to steal a little bit from Fairfax County. Don't quote me on that, please. But we are competing with this for the same businesses. We send our workforce to Fairfax County every day. In fact, about 64% of Prince William population travels outside of Prince William every day to work, whether that's to DC or Tyson's Corner or Loudoun County. They are leaving Prince William. But it doesn't mean that those job centers can't be located here in Prince William. As a chamber, we're proactively engaging with our local economic development departments, both in both cities as well as the county, to try to find ways to better utilize the resources we have here to create business centers within Prince William, to bring those Fortune 500 company headquarters closer to where their employees are living, which is out here in Prince William County.
Just a couple of very brief comments. All my experience tells me that the best economic development program is not to need one, because you've created the climate that makes investment want to be there in the first place. And clearly Virginia is doing that. My second comment is just be cautious about thinking about abandoning the military. The military is going to be the greatest recipient of government spending for a long time into the future. I think the future of that's going to be in what I would call human intellectual capital, finding the new and better ways of being able to do things. When I was doing budgeting, there's two things you look at when you decide whether you spend money on the military. Is this going to improve superiority? And is this going to improve readiness? And if it doesn't do either of those things, don't spend money on it. But if you're locked into those two issues, then they're good places to be, and there's going to be a continuing series of lessons to be learned from the two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it's going to be technological warfare as opposed to boots on the ground, because that's just too darned expensive, both in money but particularly in lives. Got to find a better way of doing that in future. Thank you.
Okay, folks, this is your opportunity. Do we have questions for the panelists? Okay, we've got 1, 2, 3. Set a good example,
I try. Al Olborn, I'm from the Coles District, and this is really for Mr. McTeague, although anyone's welcome to chime in. I lived the growth of the intelligence and defense industry government from the inside, the day 9/11 happened until about 10 years later, and with Fortune 500 companies. And I noticed that the bubble that we talk about that created the incredible wealth of Northern Virginia pretty much was driven by intense competition for scarce intellectual capital and clearances, creating salaries that rose to dizzying heights, many of which I paid people to get them, and stealing folks for huge bonuses. We gave away cars at one point to get the right skills. It appears that our salaries that we brag about have hit unsustainable levels, or a bubble, from everything I see coming out of the Mercatus Center. And the bubble's about to burst regardless of sequestration. And since you do the math, I'd like your opinion on that. Anyone else can comment at once.
I think you may well be right, and I think that the 1990s saw the world for the first time start to put a monetary value on human intellectual capacity, and the first of it went to the dot-coms. And then post 9/11, we saw the military machine start to look for that same kind of intellectual capital. I think it might plateau off. My best advice is don't mess with it. The market will sort it out, and according to need, we'll have to pay to get it. I think that one of the benefits of this area is that there are a ton of really great universities that are putting out great intellectual capital all the time. So that's helpful, that there's a new source coming on through all the time. One of the successes, particularly of Northern Virginia, but of all of Virginia, is that it has a lot of people who are pretty well paid, but not so many people who are astronomically paid as they might be on Wall Street. And I think that that's been good both socially and certainly good economically, and it's a role model that we could well afford to continue to follow.
If I might just pick up on one other thing that I think is relevant here. Part of what you have is right now is you have a lot of people who are working in some of these types of jobs that have been exactly what you've been involved with over a 10-year period that are now going to be available for companies who are looking to hire somebody to do something a little different. And that is huge. One of the other things that we have, which is a tremendous benefit that we have, is young people coming out of higher education institutions are looking to come to places like Northern Virginia and the D.C. metropolitan area. Arlington County right now, in terms of the percentage of the population between the ages of 20 and 34, is one of the top 5 in the entire country. And that's despite the fact that they have no major university. All the others that are in that category are ones where there are major universities there. We are attracting people, so people from all over the country, when they graduate from college, are often coming to this area. And these are the people who have that type of educational background that will be able to get to, and companies are going to want to hire them, pick them up to do, to grow and prosper the way other companies have in the past.
Another question? Councilman Way?
Thank you, John Wade Manassas. I addressed this to Mr. McTeague because he made the mistake of putting up an informative graph. And it has to do with the national impact as opposed to the Virginia impacts. What you showed, your graph showed, was that the sequestration impacts are really trivial on a national scale. And we're only beginning. This is sequestration number 1, but there will have to be sequestration number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. I don't know how far it has to go in order to even remotely try to address the national budget. So how is your take on how we're going to cope with a succession of sequestrations or similar budget cuts?
Thank you. I'm pleased that you picked up the lesson. The lesson was that sequestration isn't doing enough to get the American economy healthy again. And if you were to take federal government spending, state spending, and local government spending, there are many states in the United States now where that ranges between 38 and 45% of state GDP. That's what I call red zone country. And at 45% government take out of GDP, then your economy or your economic growth is starting to deteriorate. So it needs to be peeled back. The second thing is that the rising burden of debt is unsustainable as well. And we're lucky at the moment that it's sustainable because the Fed has forced the return on money to such an incredibly low level. Sooner or later it's going to go back to norms, and that's going to be a challenge. The third thing that's not quite so obvious, but I think that it's going to become increasingly more difficult for America to borrow money because the Fed is deliberately devaluing the currency to force down the price of its obligations in bonds that have already been sold. For example, there's something like $3.5 trillion that the Chinese sit on at the moment has devalued by between 35 and 40% since they bought it. So no wonder they're not very happy, and they won't let their currency rise in value because every time they do, it further devalues the stock of debt that they've got. So there are major economic problems facing the United States, and they need to be addressed. Sequestration, nowhere near fast enough. If you are going to fix this problem, you should look at fixing it inside 4 years. You should take a big hit up front, get over it, and come out the other side and get back into positive growth. That would be my advice. And when I look at the different countries around the world that have successfully got over fiscal problems like the United States. Canada, looking very much the same as the United States in 1993, balanced its budget in 3.5 years and then ran 10 years of surpluses. And it's no question that Canada came out of the recession much better than the United States. And I could reel off about 10 or 15 other countries that have done the same. The job's only just starting in the United States.
Are we ready for another question?
Connie Moser, Neabsco District. I don't know if I can make this just one question. Let me just start by saying that we are early adopters of sequestration. My husband's been unemployed for 7 weeks, and so we have a very personal face. What I guess my biggest concern is that this is the time of our life when we are saving for our retirement. So it's not so bad for us. We are debt-free people. But there are a lot of people in our circumstances that are not. So I really have two points I want to make. One is the future coming up for people who are not contributing now what they should be. The other is the 20% cuts, the furlough cuts are actually much more than that, because those people are also not going to be contributing to their 401k. And one more thing I want to add to that is we have a friend who is a military contractor, and they are looking at actually, they're counseling their furloughed employees because they may well lose their jobs because they have security clearances. So I guess I'm not sure I really have a question. And if you have something to offer to that, I would be grateful to hear it, though.
Can I just start by giving you my response first? The really terrible thing about sequestration is to make it non-discriminatory. And hopefully Congress is going to show some more intellect in the near future, and the White House, and decide that the future cuts will be targeted at things that are low priority, and in some cases saying 100% of that has to go, but these are critical areas where we should invest more. That's the intelligent way to go about it. And that, frankly, is the best way to deal with people who have to go through crisis. It's better to know that that job's not coming back and you now have to set your sights on something else and rebuild your career, rather than to be hanging in limbo on something that you can't survive on for some indefinite period of time.
And I guess I maybe kind of would comment on a couple of Connie's points. And Connie, I didn't know about your husband, so I'm very sorry to hear that. I think two things. One, the average age of defense contractors particularly, but federal contractors in general, tend to be a bit older. Particularly the defense contracting sector, a lot of them tend to be retired military or at a later stage in their life have had other careers and are now doing contracting work. So when those furloughs or those job losses hit them, it's that much harder because to find another job at an age where you're maybe 10 years from retirement is much more difficult than somebody who is, say, in their 20s or 30s looking for a job. So it's really a compounding effect, which I think you very eloquently or sadly voiced. I think, too, I don't know how to say this. I'll just pass it on to George.
I mean, obviously, you're just one of many who are going to have to be, going to face some issues and challenges. One of the things I can say is this community has already been through that in the very recent past. What happened here with the housing collapse after 2007, when the value of housing, average house in Prince William County, dropped by about 50%. In the city of Manassas, the average townhouse value between 2006 and 2009, the assessed value went down over 62%. We had tons of people who went through a foreclosure. We had all kinds of vacant properties here in the county, and yet, we haven't come all the way back from that. But it's actually very heartwarming to see how resilient things have been here in Prince William. And Prince William was ground zero for all of Virginia. It was us and South Florida and Las Vegas, basically, that took sort of those areas were the ones that took major hits. But we've already been through something that was very disruptive to a lot of people. A lot of people lost their houses, had to go through foreclosures, that type of thing. What I think we need to do is learn from that and benefit from what has happened there, and try to make sure that we move forward in progressive ways. And part of what is what Nancy was talking about earlier when she spoke. We need to get more job development in Prince William County. We don't have as much as Loudoun or Fairfax or Arlington or Alexandria, and we need to have more here locally to help be able to support people here. So we're not having people live here, but having to work somewhere else.
Connie, the amazing and frustrating thing for me is I have heard your story replicated time and time and time again over the last 18 months. One of the things I like to do when a constituent calls me is not to simply deal with them solely by email or over the telephone. I like to meet them face by face. I'd say many days I can find myself in as many as a dozen homes. Doc Anderson likes to make house calls and talk to people on their home turf. And I've heard your story replicated so many times in Prince William County. And that's the thing that bothers me, is the indiscriminate, across-the-board cuts that are being done with sequestration that inflicts great personal pain on Prince William families. And I think that Mr. McTeague's point is well taken. All this for a process that only slows the rate of budget increase. It doesn't truly cut the rate of federal spending. And I think that the feds can take a considerable lesson from us. In 2007, the federal budget, which stood at some $2.7 trillion in spending, whereas in 2013, it stands at $3.8 trillion, which is 40% larger. And so we have got to get a grip on that. We most definitely do.
And folks, despite what, unfortunately, what Connie's going through, I know she'll still be out at the Dale City commuter lot on Saturday, pruning rose bushes and making her community look better. So we certainly, and she'd love to have
volunteers welcome.
Yeah, she'd love that. So I feel like I've done my job as community news guy. So I'll pass the next question.
I'd like to turn things around here for just a second and ask how many of the folks here tonight have felt the impact or expect to feel the impact of sequestration? How many are retired? Yeah. Interesting. Let me see. Who had the next question? That's Dr. Kay.
Jack Youngjian in Occoquan Magisterial District. This is for the entire panel, but the Honorable Mr. McTeague might have some extra to say about those success stories, such as in Canada. What would be the lessons learned? I mean, were the entitlement programs addressed in Canada? That's what I was just curious. That's a rapid 3.5 years is an incredibly short time to straighten a mess out. So I just offer that question and some thoughts as to what we have to wrestle with. What's the cookbook answer, or what are the tough questions that need to be asked to make this happen in the United States?
Sir, it's very difficult to give you a brief answer to that question, which is very large. The first thing to do is stop the problem getting worse. And a number of governments have decided that they won't fund what's called the delta, so you don't get compensation for inflation. Some of them do as we did and take productivity dividends, so that's deliver the same as you did last year for less. We used to expect productivity gains from government. It's relatively recent, as I said, 1994 onwards, that we haven't been getting that. If I give you an example, just it's a little anecdote, but it might help. If you had a program in 1980 that cost $1 million, and you got the productivity gains that the private sector gets, today it would cost $425,000. If it's in the government, it's likely to be 3 times what it was in 1980. So those gaps are huge when you compound them over time. Some of the things that they did in Canada was that, for example, the Ministry for the Environment, they cut 40% out of the Ministry for the Environment because it had grown very rapidly. And sometimes government agencies grow in an unrestricted manner, and you've got to go back and say, this is doing all sorts of things that we don't really want it to do. So getting some control over what they were doing. In the military, they cut out one whole unit, the airborne. And they had a couple of reasons why they did it, but they decided it no longer fitted the configuration of the Canadian military, so that was gone. But it meant that they were able to do some other things in the military with that expenditure, and that was beneficial. In the area of welfare, it really is a matter of looking at dependency, saying that dependency is not an encouraging lifestyle. You have to look at how you can move people from dependency to independence, and that means some carrot and stick. So, for example, people who are able to work and decline to do so, you don't pay them any longer. We used to use a catchphrase for that, and that said that if you're on strike from work, we don't pay you. If you're physically able to work and there's a job there, you have to take it. Doing some of those things, putting more pressure on young people, we cut the welfare payments for young people by 30%. To give them an incentive to go to work. There needs to be a differential between the level of welfare and a working wage, so that you're not encouraging people to leave the workforce and go into welfare. When I had those slides up there before, you would have seen one of them growing quite rapidly, pensions. One of the things that's happening in the United States, which happens everywhere else where you go into a recession, a huge number of people have managed to get disability pensions that they don't really qualify for. So you've got to tighten that criteria. So there's all those kind of things going on that you have to look at. But you have to look at it like a surgeon and say, these things we have to cut out. Just deciding we're going to take so much from everywhere is a really bad policy.
And maybe just say onto that while government accounting and how government spends and budgets is certainly different than how a business would do it. There are certainly lessons that the government can and should learn from the private sector and what the private sector has done over the last decade. Taking a serious look at what your core functions are as a business, or in the government's case as a government, is vital to being able to move forward in a sustainable manner. Certainly you see it year after year, businesses constantly looking back at their books and what they did and where they made a profit or where they didn't and where they had a loss, and streamlining and making those annual decisions on what is a core function of our business. I don't think our government does that. I know they don't. And so maybe learning the lesson actually from the private sector, even as recently as this last recession, and the private sector coming out fairly well. And now that we're seeing what's holding us down is really federal government spending and keeping our economy down. If we take the lessons of the private sector of looking at our core services and only budgeting for those true government functions, we could better move forward. I would say though that does take tough decisions to be made, and those tough decisions are not always politically digestible.
One of the things I think is important to understand is, as Nancy said, the private sector has been doing quite well the last couple of years. We've certainly been driving growth here in Virginia as well as nationally. What a lot of people, I think, have a perception is that government employment has grown dramatically, and that's simply not the case. Government employment is actually down nationally over the last several years, and so we actually have a reduction in the number of government employees. So it's not that we've been creating that. What we do have is if you look at the government spending overall, there are certain things that are happening. One is, even though take an area like Northern Virginia, we don't have much unemployment. There's virtually no long-term unemployment existing in Northern Virginia. but yet we have a significant increase in the population below about 200% of poverty. And those are the people who are working, someone in the family working, they're making some income, but it's often very difficult to get by with that type of income. So what we're seeing is we're seeing an increase in the number of people who are on food stamps, even when we're not seeing an increase in unemployment, because we have people who have jobs but are just basically sort of scraping by. We see an increase in the number of children who are below 20% of poverty and therefore covered with the Medicaid program, because they don't have health insurance through their parents' program, and they're in that category. So part of what we're going to need to do is make sure that we get that economy growing in ways that it lifts everybody up, so that those people who are at the bottom and have jobs are gradually coming up, so where they can support their families fully. It's not that they're dependent on the federal government or the state government or the local government for everything. They have income, but many of them, it's that additional help, whether it's the Medicaid program for the child or the food stamp program, those types of things that really help them get by, and that's part of what we need to address.
I believe Harry had a comment.
Yeah, I do have. I think many of us know what the problem is. We probably spend too much, and we don't have enough revenue. Well, some think that we have way too much revenue, right, Michelle? What we have is we have 536 people in Washington who have spending priorities and tax priorities. We have the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the President. What I'd like to hear is a prediction of how we get out of this mess and what you would do to get us out of this mess. And when I say mess, we have an unsustainable deficit or national debt. We have Democrats protecting entitlements and Republicans protecting millionaires and billionaires. So how do we get out of it?
Because I don't live here and I can always leave if I get it wrong. There's some interesting phenomena that are worth thinking about. If you look at the last 75 to 85 years in the United States, revenue has always come in at around 18% of GDP. During some of those periods, tax rates have been as high as 70% and have been much lower than they are today. And it doesn't make any difference to that number. Why that happens, we don't know. We know that it's true. So what it tells you is that you have to get spending down to about 18% of GDP. Currently it's 24 plus. And you have to look critically at all of the things that you're doing that would take you down to that. Is there waste and abuse in government? And I like Nancy's comment because I believe that that's one of the keys, getting departments back to their core business. Can I just give you an example? And this information's probably about 6 years old, so I don't know that it's true today. We had a look at some different programs in the federal government a few years ago, and there was one that stuck out was federal programs for pregnant teenagers. And the government funded 45 of them. And 10 of them were in the Department of Agriculture. And you've got to ask yourself, what the hell was the Department of Agriculture doing that for? Isn't there somebody else that could be doing that better? We also know that if you take an activity like that, say for example something a little bit less controversial, but if you take literacy, and the federal government funds 125 programs in literacy, you'll find a very small number, about 5 or 10 of them, that are excellent at making people literate. If you take the resources and you put them into those programs, you get about 300% increase in the number of literate people. So that every program that you fund that isn't as good as those denies somebody the right to be literate. Or you can actually take those as savings. You can decide that you're going to maintain the level of the numbers that you're going to make literate, and you will take those as savings, because of money being squandered. You get programs where you're getting about 5% success rate against programs where you're getting 75% success rate. The government's not prepared to cut those. Got to get tougher and say, that's got to go. One of the other things, please, our journalist friends, excuse me for a moment. Journalists normally look at a cut in spending as a loss of services. Sometimes a cut in spending can be an improvement in services if you're buying them from better providers, and it would be nice if the media looked behind those and got some of that data and said, hey, this is a really smart decision, so that there's some reward for doing the right things. Now, I'm sure that my political colleagues will have been through some of those experiences. Thank you.
I'll chime in on that. And now's my time to talk about what I really wanted to talk about when I came here tonight. But, we had not passed a transportation bill in the state in 27 years, since 1986. There have been no major transportation bill. This year, basically what happened was everybody got together and said, we're going to do something. Now, it helped that we've been rated #1 state for business. Last year we got knocked down a couple pegs on one criterion only, and that was not a failure to invest in our infrastructure for transportation. We went to rank 33rd in the country, and that started sending a message. We also had tremendous support from the chambers of commerce, and they've been there in other years, but it was, the business community stepped up and said we need to do something. But what we also had was we had a governor who is a conservative Republican who came forward and said, we need to make an investment here. We need to be willing to break down the barriers and get past where we were in the past. In the past, what we've had is we've often passed transportation bills in the House and the Senate, but never could we get together on things. A lot of the Republicans would say, well, we're going to pass a transportation bill, we're not going to increase anybody's taxes. And the Democrats would say, well, we're going to pass a transportation bill, but we automatically have to increase the gas tax, and but we can't take any money from the general fund. So the lines were there. What happened this year was the incentive was there. We were also faced with a situation where Secretary Connaughton was saying that in 2016 or 2017 we're going to be out of money, and even the potholes that are empty now are going to get worse. And we're not going to be able to even match federal money to be able to move forward in terms of any construction projects. And oh, by the way, we're stealing $500 million a year. More than $1 million a day out of our construction fund just to leave the potholes unfilled because we still don't have enough money for maintenance there. You had the Speaker of the House of Delegates who took it as his bill and moved it forward. You had the Senate that then came forward with a very different bill. And so you had, like we had in the past, two very different bills passing out of the Senate and the House. But in the end, there was a commitment on both sides to get things done. And in the end, we increased taxes. And in the end, we took money from the general fund. And in the end, we did not increase the gas tax, even though that was something that we Democrats have been pushing for. Nobody got everything they wanted in the bill. But it was a willingness to work together to get things done that happened, and leadership that helped foster that, and public support locally. Part of what's been amazing is I met with the governor on Wednesday, and the governor took a lot of grief from a lot of people right after the bill came out. Although I think he took actually more grief from outside of Virginia than he did from within Virginia. It was people on the national political scene who were more on it than locally. And what he said was after about a week, it sort of disappeared. He said, I'm not getting the criticism I got in the past. I've been in a couple of things recently with Delegate Dave Albo, who's a Republican from Fairfax County and was the Republican from Northern Virginia who was on the conference committee who put together the package, and he really was the architect of the Northern Virginia component of it. And he said, I was really worried I was going to get bashed by a lot of people in my own party. So the first week or so, I had 30 or 40 people that contacted me. He said, but I would call them back, after they left me these nasty messages about how horrible I was for increasing their taxes and explain things to them. In the end, half of them said, oh, I agree with that. And he said, now I'm not getting that type of negative. The public actually, part of what we as elected officials have to do is be willing to work with each other to get something done. But also trust the public that if we explain it, the public's going to support it and move forward. And it's that type of leadership that has to be done. It took us 27 years to get to do it again in Virginia, but we did this year. And hopefully it won't take 27 years for the federal government to resolve this, or it'll be 2040 by then. So,
I think we're probably moving toward the bewitching hour. So let me focus a couple of observations on the federal situation. I think if you look internally at how we do things in Virginia, there is an unquestioned Virginia way that transcends party, transcends houses, transcends branches of government. And there is a Virginia way on moving forward. In Virginia, we have successfully for decades balanced our budget. We have not spent more than we've taken in. That is a model for the federal government. 49 of the state legislatures are able to do that because 49 of those state legislatures have balanced budget requirements. within their state constitutions. Now, how do we move forward federally and insert a balanced budget requirement in the federal constitution? That's far easier said than done, because the federal constitution is and should be difficult to amend. But because of the controls that we have in 49 of our states, I believe we need some sort of control mechanism so that we stay within our spending at the federal government. When I retired from the United States Air Force in 2009, I took an envelope and I figured out how could I live within my income, existing income, to enter public life and to serve my fellow Virginians, not to go north and be a federal contractor or roll over and be a GS employee in the Pentagon, which a lot of my colleagues did. And so I simply adjusted my budget to meet my income. And I would like to see our federal government do what our private citizens do, and that is live within their means. Families balance their budgets, and I wish that our federal government would do the same. Dr. McTeague, or Mr. McTeague, Dr. or Mr.? The right honorable. Spoke of addressing entitlement programs. To be sure, we have to reduce defense spending, but we also need to get an arrest on the level of entitlement spending in this country. That's easier said than done because that is obviously a political process, but we have to do it. And I look forward with optimism that we will find a way ahead because, after all, we're Americans and we typically do that.
I think we have one last question here.
Don Scoggins, I live here in Woodbridge. The question I have, I've been hearing this, and I have something I've been thinking about for many years, and that is Northern Virginia. One of the things that they tout about Northern Virginia, that it's resilience in terms of economics. So on one end, we're resilient, but we're resilient because of the presence of the federal government. So on one end, we talk about controlling spending. Then on the other end, we talk about resilience of the economy. So it's almost like we're at a conflict, So we have to figure out what we're going to, one way or the other, how we're going to do it. And I think that if we can get a control on the lobbyists, that would help, because everything that I hear public officials want to do that's great, we can go along with. Once the lobbyist gets involved and talk about, if you don't do such and such, you won't, get in the maybe campaign contributions, then everything changes. So we have to kind of be realistic, or either some of us that are kind of naive like me that wants things to be the way they should be, maybe we just have to figure out what to do about it. And I think that that's something that the public officials will have to address, because the citizens, we can talk and ask, but it's the lobbyists that control everything.
Is there a question in there?
That's the question. How do we control the lobbyists? That makes all the decisions, basically.
There's a firing squad out back somewhere in there. Kidding.
Well, Nancy's a very good lobbyist. I wish you'd get her under control, Richard, so that...
I will say, as being a registered lobbyist and the Chamber's lobbyist in Richmond, that every lobbyist represents somebody, an interest. As the Chamber lobbyist, I represent Prince William's businesses' interests in Richmond and Washington, D.C., and in Prince William County and Manassas and Manassas Park. I'd like to think that I'm lobbying on behalf of good things, helping to create jobs and build a sustainable economy. I think every lobbyist goes in with that intent. They are representing somebody. So as a profession, we've been, demonified over the last few years. It's been a couple of decades now, maybe a decade and a half since the infamous Jack Abramoff years. There are rules and regulations that regulate what we can and can't do. So I think as far as control goes, we're pretty well controlled. I think the important thing to remember is that we are, as lobbyists, just representing your interests on behalf of a constituency, just like elected officials are representing a constituency, but representing a voice that maybe would get lost in the crowd in a political arena. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
To Nancy's defense, let me speak to the lobby community and the part that they play, at least in Richmond. I can't speak to federal lobbyists who tend to be those who have been the source in the past of the most dramatic news stories in the press and the media. She referred to Jack Abramoff. Here in Virginia, 40 senators, 100 delegates. Our office staffs consist of ourselves and one legislative assistant typically. And so the lobby community here in Virginia that is well regulated is a valuable source of information for all of us about both sides of an issue. For instance, on a given bill, I count on a lobbyist who loves that given bill to come in and extol its virtues to me sitting on the couch in my office in Richmond when we're in session. But I also count on the opposing side to come in and also sit on that same couch and provide a divergent view. And by listening to those two views, just like listening to debates on the floor, that is a valuable source of information. And there have been times when I have had opposing lobbyists come into the office and both sit there and engage in a debate, and I get to sit there and ask questions. And so they are a valuable source of information for us in the absence of a professional staff. And I wouldn't have it any other way, because the absence of these large, bloated legislative staffs is truly what makes us a citizen legislature. And so that's kind of my take. I think they serve a valuable role in Richmond.
Can I just... Go ahead, Senator.
Well, let me agree with Delegate Anderson. I mean, obviously, I think we benefit tremendously from the lobbyists that operate in Richmond. They know that they better be telling us the straight truth on things, or else next time we're not going to pay attention to what they say. So, you do get a straight answer from them. And often one of the things I'll do when someone comes is ask them, okay, what's the other side saying, and who do I need to talk to on the other side? Because I want to hear from people on both sides of an issue before I decide what I want to do, just like Delegate Anderson on things. And I can tell you, one of the things that happened this year, I never voted on uranium mining because although there was a lot of stuff being talked about up front and during the legislative session, in essence, it never came to a vote in the legislature. But I can't tell you the number of meetings I had with people on both sides of that issue. And by the time we got to the point where I was getting close to the point where I might have to vote on it, and I still wasn't sure which way I was going to go on it, let me tell you, I'm now an expert on uranium mining and all the issues and different things because I kept going back to the other side and said, this is what they said, what's your response on that? And in the end, you end up a much better informed legislator to be able to make decisions.
About a year ago, Makeda started a major research program to look at cronyism and the effect that it has on decisions in legislatures. And whenever you undertake this kind of research, the hardest thing to do is try and work out what's the question you want to answer. So when you look at lobbying, there's two components. There's asking, and then there's the granting of the request. There is nothing wrong with the asking. That's protected under the Constitution as part of the freedom of speech. So you have to look at the granting of the request. And therein lies the problem, in my view. I think that the institutions of the House and the Senate are currently seriously damaged. And they're damaged because too many decisions are made behind closed doors and appear in the legislature as a fait accompli. The House continually suspends regular order and puts in place special rules to pass legislation. They use the members of the legislature in both the House and the Senate as voting fodder, who aren't able to put up amendments to offer different ideas or to offer different alternatives. A legislature is meant to be a deliberative body, and that means in that deliberative body, you should be able to pick up the best of the ideas and put them together. I hate people using the word compromise. I think it's trade-offs, and trade-offs are acceptable. Your idea is slightly better than mine. That person's idea is slightly better than both of ours. We put them together and we get something to work. Unless the stranglehold that the political leadership has in both houses on their members is in some way thwarted, then I think we're going to continue to get bad decisions. How would you do that? I think that for both of those houses, people need to get together and write for themselves a member's Bill of Rights. My leadership can't make me do these things. I can't be forced to vote for all of these issues with one vote. I should be able to separate them out. Nobody should be able to prevent me from putting forward an amendment. Nobody might like it, but as a member I should have the right to be able to put the idea up. A number of those things need to be addressed for the legislature to go back to what it used to be, a deliberative body that could produce good ideas, would reflect the population at large, and would be a discipline on the rest of the government.
Our panel here tonight, with so many looming uncertainties with sequestration, they volunteered and came here and did what few in our community have and tried to tell us what all of this is going to mean. So please, a round of applause for our panel. And in closing, I'll say, I grew up in Prince William County. I'm a native of here, and when I started PotomacLocalNews.com 3 years ago, I wanted to do so because there are so many engaged residents like yourself who live here, who are just, who not only just sit on the sidelines, but you take an active role in our community, and so that's why it was important for me to do what I do. And I'll recognize Al Alborn. He's one of the responsible bloggers in Prince William County who actually writes for Potomac Local News. And he's just one of many who take in what happens in our community, and we're able to share that with all of you online. So there's an appetite for news. We sat in this room a year ago and we said it'll be 2017 before we lose our daily newspaper. Well, 2017 came in December, and so, but there still is that news appetite for local news, and so again, thank you for having me. The Committee 100 has always invited us news people in and welcomed us, and so it's a fantastic group. I hope when you go back out and you tell others about the Committee 100 and the great think tank discussions that we have here, because they are so important to our community. With that, Mark, thank you.
I thank you very much. I think you deserve a big round of applause. You're always here at our meetings. And do you want to give us that website for your news service again?
It is PotomacLocalNews.com. We publish daily. We cover Prince William County and Stafford County.
Thank you very much for being here tonight. Thank you to Delegate Anderson, to Senator Barker, to Ms. Heitschuh, and to Mr. Mattig. It's been a very good time